There is a game most people are playing. Not a game with a board or a rulebook. A quieter one. With unwritten rules that almost everyone seems to know without being taught them. Work hard enough to be noticed, show ambition in the right amounts, compete, but not too openly. Network, perform enthusiasm, say the right things in the right rooms, celebrate the wins of people above you. Make yourself useful and visible and agreeable, keep moving forward in the direction that everyone around you is also moving. Most people step into this without much thought. Not because they're weak or unaware, but because it works, or it seems to. And because the alternative is hard to imagine when everyone around you is playing the same way. But some people stop, or never quite start. Not dramatically. There's no announcement, no manifesto. They just find themselves unable to do it in the way it seems to require. The performance feels wrong in their mouth, the latter feels like it's leaning against something they don't actually want. The enthusiasm they're supposed to feel doesn't arrive on cue. And pretending it does starts to cost more than they're willing to pay. So they quietly step to the side. And from the outside this can look like all kinds of things. Laziness, arrogance, fear, a lack of drive, a chip on the shoulder. People who are watching the game from a distance rarely get credited with having made a choice. They get diagnosed instead. Something must be wrong with them, or missing in them, that makes them unable to do what everyone else manages just fine. But that's not always what's happening. Sometimes the person standing at the edge of the game has looked at it more carefully than most of the people playing it. They've seen what it asks for, they've seen what it gives back, they've done the quiet calculation and arrived at a different answer. And they've decided, without making a fuss about it, that they'd rather not. Jung would not look at this person and see failure. He would look at them and ask what the game was asking them to give up, and whether some part of them had simply refused to give it. Because games have entry costs. Not financial ones. Psychological ones. To play well you have to invest, not just time and effort but something more personal. You have to care about the outcome in the way the game defines it, you have to want what the game says is worth wanting. Status, recognition, progress measured in the ways everyone has agreed to measure it. And for some people that wanting never quite arrives. Or it arrives and then fades. They try to feel it, and they can, briefly, but it doesn't hold. Something underneath keeps pulling in a different direction. Toward something quieter, something that belongs more fully to them. Jung would call this the self trying to surface. Not the persona, the face built for the world, but the deeper thing underneath it. The part that knows, without being able to fully explain it, that the direction everyone is moving in is not its direction. This creates a very particular kind of discomfort. Not the discomfort of failure, the discomfort of performing a life that doesn't quite fit, of waking up inside a role that made sense to everyone around you but never quite made sense to you. That feeling is hard to name and even harder to explain to people who don't feel it. So most of the time it just sits there, quiet and persistent, like something slightly out of place that no one else can see. Jung would also ask what the refusal is protecting. Because sometimes stepping away from the game is genuine clarity, and sometimes it's protection. A way of never being measured, never being found wanting, never having to find out what happens if you try fully and it still isn't enough. Both can be true in the same person at the same time. Jung wouldn't ask which one it is, he would just ask the person to look. Honestly and without rushing to an answer. Because knowing why you're standing at the edge is different from just standing there. There is a story that gets told about people who don't play the game. It forms quickly and it sticks. And it almost never begins with curiosity, it begins with a verdict. They're not motivated enough, not hungry enough, not serious enough about their future. They don't understand how the world works. They're naive, or bitter, or hiding behind something that looks like principle but is really just an excuse. The story is rarely generous and it rarely pauses to ask what the person actually sees from where they're standing. Nietzsche would find this very familiar. He spent a great deal of time watching how societies protect the stories they run on. And one of the most protected stories of all is the one that says the game is neutral. That it rewards the right things, that the people rising to the top are rising because they deserve to, that the rules, though unwritten, are fair. He would say that this story needs believers to survive. And that the person who refuses to believe it, who steps back and declines to participate, does something quietly threatening. Not to any one person, to the story itself. Because if someone can look at the game clearly and choose not to play, it raises a question no one in the game particularly wants to sit with. What if the game isn't worth it? Nietzsche understood that systems of value protect themselves. Not through force, usually, through social pressure, through the slow accumulation of looks and labels and quiet exclusions that tell the person on the edge that their position is a problem. That they are failing at something everyone else is managing, that their refusal is not a choice but a deficiency. He would call this the herd protecting its direction. Not out of malice but out of the deep discomfort that comes when someone nearby stops moving the same way. Because if one person can stop, anyone can stop. And that thought, unspoken, is what makes the person who doesn't play the game so difficult for the game to simply ignore. Camus would recognize this person immediately. Not with surprise but with something closer to quiet recognition. He spent his life writing about what happens when someone looks at the world clearly and refuses to pretend it is something it isn't. Not with anger, not with despair, just with open eyes and a steady refusal to perform a belief they don't hold. He called this the absurd, the gap between what we're told life should mean and what it actually feels like from the inside. Most people close that gap by committing fully to the game. By deciding that the rules make sense, that the rewards are real, that the direction is worth following. It's not dishonest exactly, it's just easier. The discomfort of the gap is real, and the game is very good at filling it. But some people can't close it. They see the gap too clearly, they feel it every time they're supposed to care about something that doesn't move them. Every time they perform enthusiasm they don't feel. Every time they take another step forward in a direction that doesn't feel like theirs. Camus would say that refusing the game, when it comes from that kind of seeing, is not weakness, it's honesty. A refusal to lie to yourself about what you actually value. And that refusal, he understood, comes at a cost. It doesn't make life easier, it doesn't make you more liked, it doesn't come with a reward at the end. But it does leave something intact. Something that gets slowly worn away in people who play the game for long enough without asking why. A kind of inner clarity, a relationship with your own experience that hasn't been entirely handed over to external measure. Camus never said this was comfortable. He said it was the only honest way to live for people who couldn't unsee what they'd seen. And the person who doesn't play the game, if they're doing it with open eyes rather than closed ones, is living something very close to what he meant. Not a rebellion, just a clear and quiet no. Arendt watched what happens to people who stop participating. Not the dramatic exits, the quiet ones. The person who simply stops performing in the expected way and then has to live inside the consequences of that stillness. She understood that groups are held together by shared participation. Not just shared beliefs, shared doing. Showing up in the same direction, moving at roughly the same pace, investing in the same things. When someone steps out of that movement, even silently, even without announcement, the group registers it. Not always consciously. But it registers. And then something begins. It doesn't look like punishment, it rarely feels like it from the inside either. It's more subtle than that. The person who doesn't play the game finds that certain doors don't quite open for them. Certain conversations don't quite include them, certain opportunities seem to form just slightly out of their reach, as if by coincidence, as if no one decided anything. But the pattern is there. Arendt would say this is how groups maintain themselves. Not through force but through the quiet withdrawal of access, through the slow rearrangement of who is considered serious, reliable, one of us. The person who refuses the rules doesn't get punished officially. They just gradually find themselves on the outside of things, without ever being told they've been moved there. What makes this particularly hard is that the person who doesn't play the game often can't point to a single moment where something went wrong. There was no argument, no decision. Just a slow and steady drift toward the edges of rooms they used to feel part of. And the game continues without them. Smoothly, as if they were never quite central to it. Arendt would not say this is cruel. She would say it is simply what happens when the unwritten rules are broken without apology. The group doesn't need to be angry, it just needs to keep moving, and it does. Quietly, without looking back.